I'm Jørn Schau, Professor of Flute at University of Agder and Joint Chair of the European Flute Council. I'm sitting here in Kristiansand, Norway, talking to Emanuel Pahud in Berlin. You all know Emanuel, celebrated flute soloist and principal flutist of the Berlin Philharmonic Orchestra. Dear Emanuel, thanks for joining the European Flute Festival. It is very interesting for us to have you here and being able to ask you some questions.
Thank you, Jørn, and a big hello, big warm hello from Berlin. I'm so glad to be and thrilled to be with you on this European Flute Festival.
To begin with, I'm wondering who have been your biggest influences in your musical development?
Well, my generation, growing in the 70s and in the 80s, was thrilled by every live performance and every recording released by such players as Jean-Pierre Rampal, Aurel Nicolet, or James Galway. Those were really one after the other my models throughout my youth. But I was also really inspired a lot by the great recordings from the masters, conductors, pianists, violinists, singers, and I was trying to imitate those sounds also on my instrument and playing all my favorite melodies, my favorite music on the flute, and try to express as much as I could from those great masters. I'm talking about, recordings, legendary recordings from Furtwängler or from early Karajan or Maria Callas or David Oistrakh on the violin, for example, just to name a few. But this has been, luckily, my musical horizon, thanks to the recordings, the LPs, and then later on the CDs, because my parents were not a musical family. Engineer for my father, and my mother was rather in literature.
Very interesting. In terms of the style of playing, you adopt for different pieces from different musical periods. How important is authenticity for you? And what are the challenges for a player of the modern flute in adapting their approach, for instance, in playing Baroque music?
Well, Jørn, this is a long topic. I think we would need an extra session and after hours for this, and probably a good drink also, in order to really loosen up the tongue. But what I can say is that the only authenticity that we can truly claim is to be true to ourselves, to our readings from the piece. When we read a piece of music, it's like when we read a theater play or poetry or literature. It's a language, a composer or writer has been putting thoughts in writing, and we have to understand to do the reverse processing, basically, analyzing the work as musicians or as actors do. And find the key of the interpretation of the meaning, basically, that is behind every note. Whether there's a lot of dynamics or articulation, it depends on the period. Early music has a lot less signs, but is very coded. Later music, like late romantic music or modern music, has a lot of markings and a lot of instructions, and there's less room for fantasy or for interpretation, I would say. So the creativity is in our hands in the moment of bringing this on stage. And I believe that the only thing that we can do is try to revive the soul of the composer, revive the creative power of this music and make it speak to the people of today. We are playing in halls that are today very different. We can play in an old castle or in an old church or in an old farmhouse, but we can also play in a modern concert hall. The difference in capacity can be from 20 to 2,000 or even 10,000 in some other exceptional places. And you don't play in the same way because you want to reach the people sitting also in the last row. Therefore, I always go ahead of time to the concert hall, rehearse, spend a lot of time there, make it my home. And depending on the place I'm going to play and with whom, in which kind of setup, I will try to approach the projection and the style, the mix of air and sound, the timbre, the amount of vibrato, very differently depending on which places. There is, of course, the issue of the instrument. Unlike the evolution from cembalo or harpsichord or clavichord to the modern concert piano, which has a very different sound and articulation and sustain, the evolution of the flute family has been more continuous. And it feels more like an extension of the range from the natural flutes that we know in hundreds of cultures around this planet. Baroque music, what we call Baroque music, being one of them. And I find with the modern instruments, we can, if we are interested into this, enter a dialogue also with the sound that can produce on period instruments. And let's not forget one thing, is that the period instruments were new in the time, and that composers were always writing for new instruments. Therefore, the patina or the vintage thing about these instruments nowadays didn't exist in that time. And that was not what the composers were necessarily looking for. So I guess there's a lot of things to reflect. Also, we use electricity all the time. We drive to the concert hall or use public transportation. There was no concert with tickets in many of the early years. It was a very different way of organizing, of socializing with music. The idea of the concert anyway was different. So if we want really to be to transport ourselves in that period, there's a lot of questions that have to be resolved beyond just playing on a period instrument.
Yeah, definitely. So I think it would be interesting to hear about your views on orchestral playing. Would you agree that the former distinctiveness of different orchestras seems to have become more homogenized over the past 50 years? If so, why do you think this has happened?
Well, this is an interesting point. Traveling a lot as a soloist, beyond my own orchestral experience now for the last 25 years in the Berlin Philharmonic, I do notice differences from place to place. Of course, what we have known as the Moïse, Tafanel Gobert, I would say, French flute perspective has been spreading around the world across the 20th century. Those books being translated in many languages, in England or in the English-speaking world, of course, a lot, thanks to the work of people like Jeffrey Gilbert, Trevor Y, William Bennett, with different flavors, of course, than what has happened in France or in Switzerland. A lot of these players also have went to the German-speaking world, have been also in communication. And I could remind our fellow flute players that Joachim Andersen was a principal flute player in the Berlin Philharmonic, assistant conductor of Hans von Bülow, the founder of the orchestra, and then later on went to America and has founded a flute school over there. So there are a lot of connections, interconnections between all these flute schools, and has now, as you could suspect, the level has been, of course, raising tremendously, and the tools for communication and the possibilities to exchange in the studies. So both for the teachers and for the students to exchange information, to have access to information from each other, and to spend a semester or a year in another place has evolved tremendously. So therefore, I guess that internationally, the word is spreading and the flute standard has evolved. And we cannot say what was specifically Russian, French, Scandinavian, English, German, Italian, or Japanese or American anymore. Nevertheless, if I take the example of German orchestras, in the Berlin Philharmonic since 2000, the year 2000, more or less, there are more foreigners than Germans in the orchestra. After the World War II, when it was Furtwängler, when Nicolai was playing there were 3 foreigners in the orchestra. Everybody else was German. So there's an incredible evolution of such iconic orchestras towards internationalization. But this is not the case for more traditional orchestras. I would quote, for example, Dresden or Leipzig, that represent more the German tradition. And I guess there also, if you take Russian ensembles, Mariinsky or Moscow, of course, represent probably more Russian tradition than it used to be in times of the Soviet Union, because there you had a lot of the other Soviet republics that were centralizing into the cultural activities in those cities like Moscow, Petersburg. So the evolution is really different from place to place. We do have, through our academy system, for example, at Berlin Philharmonic, a lot of international students coming to spend 2 years with us, postgraduates, and a lot of people come from Taiwan, from China, from Korea, of course, because the level is just tremendous and excellent. Most of them have been studying also, of course, in Europe for those years. So we have a lot of people from all across Europe, also some American people or people from Latin America coming. So whichever the level, whether it's at the entry or at the exit, you find a lot of people from everywhere around the world who have studied in the same places, yet they think and feel music differently. And that's the wonderful thing.
Yeah. But pointing to a maybe very general principle, given that different orchestral styles demand different approaches, in your opinion, how important is a distinctive flute sonority within an orchestral sound? And is it possible to say something in general about how much the flute should blend with the rest of the section? I mean, this is a very general question, but do you have some thoughts on this?
Well, this is the challenge of playing principal flute in an orchestra. You have to be, depending on the repertoire and depending on the bar, nearly within a phrase, either a very prominent soloist or to be completely matching the woodwind organ, I would say, or sometimes like playing octaves with the violins, or thirds with the second flute, or then combination with other of the instruments, unison with the principal oboe. You do have to use different blends of air, tone, vibrato, speed. The vibrato speed is very critical to intonation within a section, for example, with the winds, because clarinet players traditionally use no vibrato, some of them a little bit, which doesn't disturb me as long as we can match it. The thing is that we should be prepared when we come to the first rehearsal, so that if the conductor asks us to play this way or that way, to add vibrato or not, or slow it down, or amplitude, or change the dynamics, or the articulation, whatever, we can do this instantly. This flexibility. And it's not how we think the music is that is important. We are serving the performance of the conductor. And this is really a very major difference to me in the activity as a solo player and as an orchestral player. Of course, if you are playing Daphnis and Chloe or any other important solo from the flute literature, the conductor will ask you, how do you want to do it? I'm accompanying you throughout this section, and this is wonderful. But depending on who is the conductor, I will play differently, because the context of what has happened before and what is going to happen after, and the tension in the music, the whole big painting, the whole big picture, I would say, of the music becomes different. And therefore the role of the flute player becomes also different.
Yeah, exactly. But back to your solo playing. You've been an enthusiastic supporter of new music for the flute. What are the most exciting projects you've recently been involved with?
Well, new music is something that in many ways keeps me alive. I realized that throughout my career for now, since I was age 17, the first time I was on stage and got a fee for that performance, I've been playing certain pieces of the repertoire, such as Mozart concertos, Ibert concerto, De Vienne concerto, Poulenc sonata, Dutilleux sonatine, Franck Martin ballade, Berio sequenza. Such pieces are core repertoire, but you repeat them very often in your career. And in order to explore new ways, the collaboration with composers is essential, basically. We can be so extremely thankful to Rampal that he suggested to such numerous composers to write a concerto for flute, like Jindřich, like Khachaturian, for example. But also, he premiered also Chandelinos as a student for his examination. He was not lucky to get that new piece for that year examination. But he has been really suggesting a lot of new compositions. And this is something that Nicolet, and then later on my teachers, De Bost and Marion, who all had a proximity in their work with Pierre Boulez, for example, have been really giving to our generation of students. This is really something that I learned in Paris more than anywhere else, I would say.
Yeah.
And since the Mozart celebration for the Mozart 250th anniversary, that was in the year 2006, I was asked to play the Mozart concertos nearly virtually every concert that I had that year.
Yeah.
And after 20 times saying yes, I started saying no. I don't want to play either of the Mozart concertos this year, but I can play his quartets. They are wonderful pieces. They're really little flute concertos for chamber setup, or Mozart sonatas or transcriptions from the violin. They said, no, but we want to do concerto. We want to do something. Then I said, okay, I can play the Andante, but only if we do a modern work that responds to the Mozart flute concerto. And this is how it all started, commissioning works. I started with my own orchestra in Berlin. We commissioned to Marc-André d'Albavie, then later on Lucerne Festival to Matthias Pincher, then later on in my birth town in Geneva with Orchestre Suisse Romande with Michael Jarel, local composer also. And all of these composers have been writing new pieces for me. Right now, currently, I'm not yet working on it, but I'm planning for next May a new concerto by Estonian composer Erkki Sventur. And this is going to be conducted by Paavo Järvi with Berlin Philharmonic, and then the next season in Zurich Tonhalle, his home orchestra. And over there we also commissioned a new flute concerto to Toshio Hosokawa, the great Japanese composer. And this piece I'm going to repeat also a few months later in Japan. Last year, during the lockdown, I had so much time to practice for myself. At last, after 25 years of dashing all across the country, I felt like a student again, and I learned a lot of music. And I asked composers who wrote a flute concerto for me, can you make a solo piece from the material? Can you condense it? And then we decided with Daniel Barenboim here in Berlin and other musicians to present all of this in a new music festival. We had a lot of flute music presented there. So I find it a thrilling activity to keep my mind alive, and also when you are in exchange, in conversation with composers of today, it helps you understand the composers from the past and the power of analysis that this has given me in how I look at a Beethoven sonata or chamber music or symphony, and then Schubert also, but also Mozart and then Bach. Then this is the resolution, power of resolution in the analysis that you can train by working with composers of today is really so helpful in the understanding of the music from the past.
In a conversation like the one we're having here, I think it's natural to talk about the flute instruments. The start of a flute design and manufacture have improved dramatically in recent times. Which do you think are the most important improvements, and how much further do you think instrument innovations can take us?
It's
it's a difficult question.
It is an easy question because all of them have been making tremendous projects, and there have been some incredible inventions. I remember in the 80s, everybody was talking about the Albert Cooper scale and head joints, and this has become, thanks to some flute makers, particularly the Brennan brothers in those years, have been incorporating these developments together with the invention of Brugger for the acoustic and for the mechanics, also really raising the standard to a level of quality in the making that has been now matched by all the flute makers worldwide. And this has been a major step forward. And I find a collaboration also between the head joint makers and the flute makers, which has started with this collaboration back in the Cooper years. I've seen other head joint makers like Lafan, for example, but also Faolisi, for example, also Manke, really collaborating with various flute makers. I find also the development of the wooden instruments has been so tremendous in the last decades. When I was a student, there were barely any wooden instruments. It was all very
exactly.
prototype kind of situation. Now it has become really a standard. In many orchestras, people play wooden instruments. I find myself, they don't take travel so well. So with the air conditioning, with the heating, with the different temperatures and moisture in different places, it's not easy to travel only with one wooden flute, for example, because it's more sensitive. There's more wood than the piccolo. But in my section in the orchestra, Michael Hazel is playing on the brown wooden flute that he developed himself back 25 years ago.
Yeah.
And I find they are excellent instruments. I also own one myself. But I tend, because of the variety of the projects that I play, to play everything on my 14K golden flute, for which I have several combinations with several head joints depending on what repertoire I'm playing on. So without wanting to advertise for the one or the other flute maker, but we all know who is around, and we just need to go to one of our wonderful festivals across the continent, and to a convention. And now, fortunately, after COVID, we can think about resuming these kind of activities gradually, in some way, meeting again, to share this information. Go out there, try out the instruments. What one should be careful is not to listen too much to what we produce here, but to see how the sound is traveling in the acoustics of the space we are playing in, because this is what we want to do. We want to reach the people with our instrument. We don't want to please ourselves so much. This is okay for practice, but then when it's about performance and the concert stage, we need to look for instruments that do project, do carry, do give people the bigger picture.
Yeah, exactly. Another inevitable question relates to COVID pandemic, which has seriously affected the performance arts worldwide. What are your views on the advantages and disadvantages of online performance and teaching?
I had myself I have very mixed feelings about this experience. On the one hand, the technology that allows us to talk in this quality now and to have a lot of virtual online elements or meetings produced professionally is amazing and is really great. And this is something that we have learned to deal with and that we have been developing a lot. And this is really great. On the other hand, I must say, for the interaction in the situation of performing or teaching, it's very difficult to be in a remote place and to be connected only electronically. I've had not positive experience in making joint musical concerts where everybody was in a different connection because of the timing issues. I've not been successful either at teaching online interactively. What we can do, I find, is listen to a performance and then make comments and have this conversation together afterwards. This works really nice. Yet the teaching situation and to follow up is really, I find, to be more specific about what to correct. The position, the sound adjustment, and this kind of posture adjustment is very difficult to appreciate with a microphone and a camera, and not making, or even the breathing, which is so essential to our playing, is not to be identified so well as live in person. So, on the contrary, the concert productions or the film productions that we have been doing at Berlin Philharmonic were exactly the same like what we were doing since 2008 with the digital concert hall. So we have a channel, we have a technology, we have cameras, and we've been going on playing every week without audience in our hall, but our audience worldwide, hundreds of thousands of people sitting in their home could connect and listen to us playing live for them. This was the most important thing. It was not a production prepared, edited, or whatever. It was a true concert being played live for them in that moment. And this has been a great experience because you just go live and you have a one time to nail it, you know, and rather than the traditional recording process where you have time to edit things, you can relax and then correct things. And for me, it has been wonderful to perform such pieces like Busoni Divertimento or Iber Concerto with my orchestra and under Daniel Barenboim, for example. or Prelude to the Afternoon of a Faun, also with Kirill Petrenko, and other such works. In this situation, with the knowing that we go live and now we play, and that's it. And it has been so intense that I forgot after a while that there's nobody in the hall. And it's only after that I said, did this really happen? And now that we are back in many countries, we're allowed to have audience back in the hall. The warmth, just to see faces, to see expression, to see the people watching at you, to share this moment, to be together in the same space. This is so valuable, and this is so human and full of warmth. I think that's the way to go. But technologies can, of course, help, and is really something that we have learned, I think, to use better in certain situations. And I think it's very good now to make and to produce, for example, recordings for pre-selection for competitions and this kind of thing, because now we can do more professional recordings.
My last question relates to the younger generation. Many educators highlight the increasing difficulties in engaging young people in music making in a world where instant gratification and money seems to be most important. Is this a situation you recognize? And do you have any thoughts or strategies to overcome this in the flute world?
I've faced the situation of meeting young musicians around the world in a Q&A session, and question and answers, because that's when I'm on tour most of the time what I can do, more than the true masterclass or a true visit to a conservatory or public masterclass. And I was surprised how often some of the naive questions are like, I would like to be famous like you. Because honestly, if you want to be famous, don't do classical music.
No, exactly.
do some acting, politics, sports, shows, but not classical music. It's about cultural heritage and keeping it alive and sharing what we believe in. And about being expressive about it, also giving it really in the moment of the concert like the shape of a hologram, I would say, of the vision that we have in our minds. I think of landscape, but I also think of characters. Every piece there's something like a script. I find a dramatic script, a conversation, or a drama, or a comedy, or whatever. So to try to bring this to life and to give it the quality of the moment that we're really living and experiencing in the moment of the concert is something essential. And this is what I try to answer. And then some of the next questions are in certain places where the culture these people have been growing in, particularly, for example, if I take China or Korea or Japan, where the education at home may have been very different than the education that they have then received in our conservatories in Europe later on. Is that how do I know which expression to use when? What is happy? What is sad in music? So it's true. If you take Piazzolla's tangos, for example, the minor is proud and happy, and the minor is let go and starting to let it's the opposite of the way of seeing things from Europe, for example. So we have to identify these kind of things in the musical language, and we can bring it back to life in the moment of the stage. But it's hard, it's tough today to teach what is actually practice. And a lot of people think that practice is just warming up. Warming up is getting things loose, like every sportsman does before training, so that they don't break their muscles. And it's like a singer or an actor. They don't go screaming in the hall. No, in the rehearsal, they just go speaking softly, etc., so that they work on their intentions, on their nuances, and then only in the moment of the performance, they will use the full power once or twice in the show. But we have to drive this energy, and when we practice, we have to think about every note that we do, because otherwise we practice not thinking.
Yeah.
We practice if we let the mistakes come by also, and repeat one more time, and then we make again another mistake or the same mistake, then we have learned playing that mistake. We have been practicing doing this. So this is the thing that I find the most important to transmit and to teach, is that we can give as the teachers the tools, the methods, the objectives set, and the way to get there. But somebody, the student, has to do the walking or the running, and we can, we can show the way. We can open the door. We can let breathe the air. We can push. But after a while, we have to learn how to. The best teachers are the one who actually make themselves superfluous, and the best students are the one who learn how to deal without the teachers, and then move on to their own next level, basically.
Yeah. Dear Emanuel, the European Flute Council thanks you very much for joining this conversation and for sharing your views and experiences with us. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Bjørn, and all the best to the European Flute Council.
Thanks.